Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for joining me wherever you're tuning in from. Today we're talking about a new watch from Tornek Rayville, the Blakjak Type 7B. This is a new watch from a brand that of course has their roots in bringing military watches to life dating back to the 50s. I've got a lot more details on that history and what makes it so interesting now live on the Deep Track along with the full review of this watch. I'll leave a link to that down below. But I wanted to get some thoughts out on this watch in particular and how it pertains to tool watches in general and military watches and where we draw some of those lines sometimes. The Blakjak Type 7B that we have here is a recreation of a watch made in the 90s by Stocker and Yale, the Sandy 660. That watch was approved for issuance from the US government. It's all limited action in the hands of servicemen and women, though not many of them were produced. It's a watch that stands apart for being done in a steel case and not cheap black plastic. The design for that watch was relatively interesting. It was a military navigator's watch, and as you might expect, it has a pretty straightforward, simple appearance with a ronda quartz movement inside. The design has been captured here by Tornek Rayville and refined in a few ways, though they haven't really lost the plot with the design. It still looks very much like the Sandy 660, but it feels a bit more modern in its execution, which should come as no surprise. Tornek Rayville offers this watch with two different bezel options. There's a fully indexed elapsed time bezel here, as well as a 12-hour GMT bezel that you can have on the insert. One thing that makes this bezel so interesting though is how tall it stands up off the case. There's kind of two tiers that you can grab on here to manipulate the bezel. It's a 120 click bezel, and it's pretty easy to grab onto and use, especially if you're wearing gloves or something like that. And another thing that makes it interesting is the bezel insert is angled downward towards the dial. It's a pretty subtle thing, but it is noticeable, and it kind of helps funnel the focal point down into the dial. But what makes this watch really interesting is the design of the ray hot, which is also kind of deeply sloped towards the dial and houses a luminous tube that encircles the dial that's visible at every 5-minute segments. Now, there's not a ton of surface area here for the lume, either there or in the hand or anywhere else for that matter, so the lume isn't quite as strong as you might expect with some like modern tool watches, but they didn't compromise on the design of the original. So I think that's telling in what their goal is here in this watch. Its goal is to honor and preserve one of the lesser known parts of military history in the Sandy 660. And they've done that at the expense of creating a through and through modern tool watch. This watch does lean a little heavily into the military influence here. It has the no radiation symbol on the dial. It has all the markings on the case back. And Tornek Rayville include a case study here with the technical specifications that go so far as to create a fictional series of events that place this watch in the context of the theater of war. Now, when I think of military watches, I think of three different distinctions that I would classify them in. The first are simply tool watches that are suitable to be used in that kind of an environment and are often taken into that kind of environment by servicemen and servicewomen, but are not issued by the government. The second is military-inspired watches, and that's where I would place this watch, which is a watch that is inspired by a military watch design from the past and brings it back almost one-to-one, and its job is really to tell that story rather than to create a modern watch that is perfectly capable of going into that kind of environment. Now, this watch may be that, but I do think there's better options out there when it comes down to that kind of thing. The third is, of course, actual military-issued watches. And these are watches that have been approved by the government from approved manufacturers that are issued to service members for their tours and then given back to the CIF at the conclusion of those tours. And those watches ultimately belong to the government or to that unit, whatever it may be. So those are rare watches to kind of see out and about these days. This watch measures 42 millimeters wide at the bezel, and it's a bit wider than that at the base of the case, which flares out a little bit. And that base of the case is actually pretty flat and sits on the wrist really well. It's actually a pretty comfortable watch, but visually there's a lot of heft in the top portion, and that is due to this kind of towering bezel structure here, which adds a lot of personality to the watch. It's not entirely unlike watches that we've seen from Seiko, and it's an effective design overall. It certainly adds to the personality here. The watch is 13 millimeters in thickness and about 49 millimeters from lug to lug. This watch ships with a steel bracelet that's equipped with quick release tabs, so it can be changed out to the rubber unit that it comes with or the black nylon unit that it comes with that is from Meritech. Overall, this is a very cool watch, and I like the story that it tells. Do I think that they need to lean into the fictitious military elements that they do? Probably not, but I do like the story that this watch tells about the actual Sandy 660 watch. Because of that, this watch stands at odds with something like the Tudor FXD that has been developed for the likes of the French Navy, or even the black-dialed Tudor FXD, which was made as a nod to some of the original issued Tudor Submariners. Now, those watches aren't bringing a look from the past back and making it work today. They are moving the concept forward with through-and-through modern designs that would work just as well in any of these environments today, and I would see fitting right in battle or diving or whatever it might be put into under military use. This watch is a little bit different. I don't see it being used in such a manner, but I do see it as preserving something important. So I view it in a slightly different vein than most tool watches and judge it a little bit differently as well. Unlike the original, this one uses a Seiko-built automatic movement, and it is priced at $895. This watch is available for configuration and pre-order from Tornek Rayville now. As I mentioned, I have a lot more of my thoughts on this watch and on just tool watches in general as they relate to military watches now live on the Deep Track. I will leave a link to that down below. A quick note that the Deep Track is reader supported. I'll leave a link to our Patreon down below as well. If you enjoy this content, now's a great time to subscribe, and leaving a like and share helps me out a lot as well. Thanks so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care.